So this is in conversation, and I'm going to just be posing a few questions to Neal, and we're just going to be two people up here having a bit of a conversation about life and innovation. In fact, the last time Neal and I were on a panel together, and I mentioned this for two reasons, was on the fringes of the FinTech Festival last year at the birthday celebration of DBSX, your innovation
Oh, that's
hub.
right, yes.
And as I said, I mentioned that for two reasons. One, if you're not familiar with the work that DBS does on innovation, you really should become familiar. If you ever get the chance to visit what they're doing inside the Innovation Centre, it's really exciting and it's really groundbreaking. However, it's not just an innovation centre. The whole bank has rethought a design way of thinking, and from the CEO down, innovation's become everyone's business. And so that's something we can probably draw out in the conversation as well. But I also mention it for two reasons, because the last time Neal and I were up on a panel, Neal was asking me the questions, so now I get to ask him the questions.
I remember now. I regret being so difficult with you now. The tables have turned.
That's it. So over the course of the day, Neal, we've heard about how different barriers that might come up. Some of them are technology barriers, some of them are people barriers, from existing infrastructure to people's mindset. And there's a whole long list of things that people talk about as being barriers or risks to innovation. What do you see as sort of the biggest risk?
I would say regulators, but then I don't think I'll get out of the room alive. Really, the biggest single thing I see is ego. Mm-hmm. When I first started at DBS, I lost count of the amount of times that, I'm not a banker. Bankers that would say to me, "Hey, Neal, you don't understand this industry. I've been in this industry 20 years. This is how the thing works." And it's not so much that they're walking around, I'm the big I am, because that's really not an Asian thing. It's more that they feel they know best. Mm-hmm. That every problem in their business can be solved by them, that they have the information, they have the ability, and they feel they know what their customers want. And that really is the biggest killer I've seen in innovation. And it instantiates itself in many different ways, from comments like that to me. Obviously, they don't say that to me anymore. I think I've proved myself to that regard. But if you think about the difference I've worked at tech companies and startups and now bank, there's three main differences I see. So one is around hierarchies. Mm-hmm. So I've noticed in a bank, and actually in many companies, in fairness, it's not just in banking, it's very hierarchical. You have layers and layers and layers of people above you. Everyone's trying to push up, and there's distinct lines of control. And in a tech company, they tend to be quite flat. Mm-hmm. In a bank, you tend to, especially in Asia context, and in companies in Asia generally, is people will not talk back to someone more senior. Now, I worked at Microsoft, and I could quite happily tell someone 4 or 5 levels above me that I felt they were wrong. And as long as I explained, I say, look, this is great that you said this is the way to do it, but you've done this in the US, we're in Australia, it's actually different here, I think we should do it like blah, blah, blah. And you wouldn't worry about your career. You wouldn't leave that meeting thinking, oh my God, is this going to affect my bonus? Is this going to affect my career? It's just business. That's how we operate. But I noticed that in banking, you tend not to do that. You mm-hmm. are concerned about, will it affect your bonus? Will someone talk to your manager? Will you get into trouble? The second thing is really around kind of experimentation. And so a bank is schizophrenic in my mind. Regulators are schizophrenic as well, which actually our head of the regulator, Ravi, mentioned in an article. But banks are especially schizophrenic, which makes me kind of smile sometimes, because on one hand, as a bank, we'll risk lots of money on the lend side, yeah? And we had to write off, it was in the press, we had to write off, a couple of $100 million due to the oil and gas, decline in Singapore at the time last year. And so we're happily, well, probably not happily, but we will prepared to take risks. To make money, we price risk, we monetize risk. And yet, when I work internally and try to get them to do something a little bit ambitious, they're like, oh, no, we can't do that, it's too risky. Wait a minute, we just lost 200 million over there. What we can't do, and so it's really schizophrenic that banks are in the business of risk. I mean, I'm not a banker, but observe that we're in the business of risk. We price and monetize risk, but we don't have that same risk appetite when it comes to internal things. But then you look at tech companies are quite different. So they're very experimental. They'll try new things. They'll try small things. Netflix is constantly running 1,000 experiments, changing the way it puts things on pages. The same with Amazon, and they try stuff because think about it. If you don't know what the future holds, then the best way to work that out is to try these small kind of low-risk experiments and kind of innovate your way forward and try and find something which sticks, and is going to work. Actually, Instagram did this. So Instagram were thinking, is this business going to work? So what they did, they sat in Times Square and they stopped tourists and said, hey, would you, for $5, we'll improve your photos you took today. And they had a laptop and they take the card out and they put it in the laptop and they kind of, image, upgrade all the people's photos and write it back to their camera card. And they realized there's actually a business for photos to be enhanced that people take, and that's how Instagram was born. And then the third thing is really around collaboration and ownership. A bank tends to own everything. It owns its staff, it owns its tech, it owns its branches, its ATMs, and they don't tend to have too many partnerships. They'll have card partnerships, maybe some bank assurance partnerships, and maybe, obviously the institutional side will have kind of product partnerships. But that's it. I mean, really.
So you paint a fairly sort of bleak picture of the industry then, sort of a very closed society that thinks that no one that's in this society doesn't understand what they're doing, and so they don't want to listen to them. Very much a will not speak up mindset, will not challenge leadership in particular, for fear of retribution, and also very much the compliance mindset. So you're right, on one hand, they sort of will take risk on loan books, but on the other hand, we'll have, if you like, 4,000 compliance rules internally that has to be ticked off in triplicate before anyone can sign. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, really. I mean, I never wanted to work for a bank. Fairness. Right. Yeah, I'd sold to banks for many years. I've had many banks around the world offer me roles before, but never really wanted to. I mean, DBS, in fairness, was different. I like their leadership, but the culture is not particularly. I've never found particularly nice because coming from a tech company where you walk into an open space, you chat to someone, they're like, hey, what are you working on? I'm working on this. Hey, I'll give you a hand with that if you want. Just say, oh, okay, where do you work? I work in this division and blah, 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 and maybe we can do some kind of partnership. And I know a guy in the US, maybe he wants to join. And it's just that instant collaboration of people working together that really, and that culture to do the amazing that banks lack.
But if I could sort of challenge that a little bit, though, in the sense of banks are a very highly regulated industry, and that's a part of it. But one of the reasons they're highly regulated is they're so critical to society. Yeah. And they have to make sure everything's done correctly. So I'm sure you'd find very similar things if you looked at airlines or mining companies in terms of the amount of rules you have to follow and the procedures you have to follow. So how do you then create that sort of innovative environment when you must make sure everything is run soundly, and the desire for change is actually innovation is perhaps, if you like, a prudential risk for banks. You don't want banks making risky decisions every day. You want them to be soundly run using sound principles that have been tried and tested over time. So isn't there a reason that the banking system's like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always an excuse not to innovate.
Yeah. Sorry, I tried to defend the banks.
Yeah, no. I mean, I work for a bank. I mean, I love bankers. My best friends are bankers. I will get out of this room alive. Is there a back door? But I think the biggest problem I find with regulation is not actually the regulators. It's the interpretation. And so regulators don't draw straight lines. You draw kind of fluffy lines, which is kind of don't do this, maybe not that, which is great. But then what happens inside the bank is that when an innovator tries to do something, the low-level compliance person goes through his checklist, no, regulators won't let you do that. And actually, that's not true. When I go and talk to the regulator, they're like, oh, yeah, please do that. Oh, thank God you're going to do it, because we're trying to get people to innovate.
Yeah.
And so you can overplay that command and control, is my point. It doesn't need to have that. There's certain parts of the organization which absolutely should be protected and should run in a very uninnovative way. People who look after core banking, the mainframes, But then there's other areas where a DBS, one of our most innovative teams actually is the compliance and the audit teams. Because innovation doesn't mean that you throw everything away. Innovation just means, actually, it's to ask that simple question is, do we have to do it this way?
Is there a better way?
Yeah, I mean, we could, because we found an interesting thing. We did some innovation in Hong Kong, and what we wanted to do was, our vision was, if you were in a shop, and you were in a queue to buy something, and you saw a poster that said 5% off of the DBS card, that you could sign up for a DBS card, and it would get delivered to your phone, and by the time you got to the front of the queue, you could pay for it. Really, really great vision. We actually released it. What we found is, in the new credit card form, there was 40 data items we've been collecting for years.
Yep.
Only 15 we actually used anymore.
Right.
But if a customer had forgot to fill out one of the items we never used, we'd been refusing them credit cards.
Yep.
So we've been refusing credit cards to people for data we don't even need or want.
Or know what to do with.
Yeah, so once we start deconstructing there's a lot of historical, the thing with banks is they're quite historical as well. Many are very old, and people assume that, oh, we've always done it this way, and there's sometimes actually it's not a valid reason for it. And it's just kind of asking, is there a better way? Do we actually have to do this anymore? Or is there a better way to do this?
That comes back to your earlier point about ego, right? That we know best. We know this, and our institution's been the biggest bank for so many hundreds of years, if you like. How do you actually deal with that ego issue when you're trying to innovate?
The best thing I find is get the customers to tell them they're wrong. I mean, I can tell them they're wrong, but I like to get my bonus every year. The job for Chief Innovation Officer is to slowly get fired while affecting change. And so what we do is we did a thing with the MDs, and we got them to invent their own fintech companies. Mm-hmm. And we got them to we went through a stepped innovation process. There's videos online about it. And it takes them through kind of, here's the challenge. We want to, for example, grow our credit cards with students, for example. That'd be the challenge. We take them through a step process, and they end up drawing a kind of poster on that innovation, or even, kind of mobile phone screens on paper. And then we get them going into the street and stopping people in the street and going, hey, do you mind, I want to go through, I'm from DBS Bank, this new innovation. And it's great. So we send them out. They're all excited because they've invented something. Yeah, look at me. I'm a startup person. I'm a tech company. How many bank CEOs say that now? I think all of them say that now. There must be a magic fairy that just goes, well, you're a tech company now. I find it takes about 5 years and $1 billion. But anyway. And then what happens is they're really excited. Then they go out into the street and they come back quite downcast. And they go, oh, I said, how'd it go? Oh, yeah. Well, they liked it. And I go, oh, that's good. Clearly they didn't. What was the feedback? Oh, they didn't like this, and they didn't like that. And they said, maybe the offers should be this. And I said, oh, that's a shame, because I really liked your innovation. I didn't. I thought it was rubbish. But the customer told them, and you can't argue with the customer. That is the biggest single thing, is then they realize, I don't know best anymore. Yeah. And then they start to open up and go, well, maybe the answer's with a fintech. See, this is the problem with ego is, then if you can break that down and realize actually that self-realization that maybe I don't have all the answers now, and a customer just told me that the thing I invented isn't particularly good, then they'll start working with fintechs. Then they'll start collaborating with other people in the organization. Then they'll start, they'll stop micromanaging their staff as much. And so there's a whole knock-on effect once this ego starts to break down, And they start to realize actually that they're going to be more successful by partnering than not by partnering. And believe me, it's not a bank thing. Yeah. It's a standard corporate thing.
Yeah. But you'll have to keep doing that, right? Because the moment they think they've solved one problem, then they think the ego comes back, right?
Well, that's it. I mean, it's corporate culture is like a piece of rubber. So you have to kind of inspire people, I find, to stretch the rubber. And then you need to put KPIs through as nails right. to hold it in place. Right. And so it's compulsory now at DBS for every leader every year to go through this process and invent something like that. And then the important thing then is because then they push it down to their teams, and now every single project in DBS, we do about 350 a year, have to use this process. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the CEO will ask you, say, well, where's your experiments? What do the customers say? So getting to that point where every project uses this is critical. And you find we've noticed there's a huge change in the culture. And then also they've made a mistake as well, which is very hard for a banker to make a mistake. I mean, actually, that's probably the crux of the industry is, right. As a banker, you can't make a mistake. Well, we do, but, you know, that's, unfortunately, that's part of our business. But to be okay, and I made a mistake, and I learned from it, and here's how I changed this innovation, and then customers loved it. That's really critical.
But it has to come from the top as well, right?
Yeah.
If Piyush wasn't sitting every manager down, -1, -2 below him, and saying, what have you done, how have you done this? Yeah. This would just be an innovation experiment by the innovation person who's off in their little innovation hub.
Oh yeah, I would have been politically destroyed long ago. Yeah. You need consistency, so you need the CEO constantly saying the same message. Because with all
but not just saying it, surely.
Yeah,
living it as well.
Yeah. Because, you know, every year, I'm sure all of you in companies, every year the CEO has a new bright idea. And then, you know, the people who are really passionate go and try this new thing, whether it's agile or design thinking or data or whatever, or work with startups, or magically you're a tech company. But you know that next year there's a new message, and the year after there'll be a new one. So most people are like, why do I bother? I'll just wait, I'll half do it, tick the box, next year it'll be different. So not only do you need them articulating it, you need consistency year after year. You know, it's not going away, you have to do it. So it's a top-down, but CEOs can only shout so far. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they're good shouters, but it only goes down a few levels. And then what you need is the bottoms up, which is to, you know, inspire the lower level staff that they can do something different and really inspire them, hopefully, to do their career's best work. So it's kind of, it's bottoms up and then tops down. And then you've got this middle layer called the problem children, which are kind of mid to upper level management. And they're the ones that you keep squeezing, and eventually you can break through that.
We actually, in Deloitte, we called it, when we're looking at just corporate culture overall, so not just bank culture, but corporate culture overall, you get the right tone from the top, which is great. And then you get all the graduates who've come in, and we all know the sort of stereotypes about millennials. They want to do something good for the world and all that sort of stuff. And then there's what we call the permafrost.
Oh, permafrost,
which is just, you can't drill down through it, and you can't drill up through it, and it's just frozen in time. Yeah. And that seems to be one of the biggest issues, right? Is actually, because they've got different KPIs in there. It. They've got different compliance metrics they're managing to, financial metrics.
That's it. I mean, another big problem and difference in tech companies and banks is a tech company will have an army of people working out how the KPIs go down, but also how they go across an organization. So they literally must millions every year Microsoft spends on this. So to make sure that people, because KPIs and corporate governance has turned into basically a committee which says no, and then KPIs have turned into hit your bonus, when actually, you know, corporate governance is meant to be turning your vision into reality, and KPIs is meant to be about setting the behavior you want to see in the organization. And both of those have kind of got muddled up over time. So being very scientific on how you set KPIs is really important, both for intended and unintended behaviors that you could see.
Yeah. Now, there's lots of buzzwords. We've only got sort of 1 minute left. There's lots of buzzwords. You mentioned the word agile. One of the questions that has come through on the app is, what do you think of agile? I guess my question would be, is it just another buzzword? Is it truly a revolutionary way of doing business?
I quite enjoyed using it 20 years ago, and it's good that it's come back now, and it's got a capital A, which is a big improvement. But I think if you stick too rigidly to anything is a bad thing. I just think with all these things, you've just got to be thoughtful on when you use it, how you use it, have consistency, have the same language across all the groups. I mean, a good way of any of these new programs is hub and spokes. You have a central team which manage the consistency in the process, and then you have spoke kind of teams that are out in the businesses actually driving the outcome from that. And I think the other thing is the finance is to raise our ambition. Yeah. So as we break down the ego and they start innovating, is to get them to do stuff that not only no bank has ever done, but no company in the world has ever done. Yep. And that's, you know, how you be truly world class. Yep. I think that's important as well.
It's not innovating at the margins, it's truly innovating in the way you do things.
Well, yeah, just take, you know, trying to drive through, take those blinkers off, because at no point in human history has the knowledge of banking been less relevant. Because today bankers need to understand, you know, social media, data analytics, artificial intelligence, you know, innovation, design thinking, experiments, prototyping, fintech, startups. And so you've got a much wider toolkit, and you can actually do something that the future of the finance industry has been written now. And so kind of, rather than do this, like I said, this incremental, you know, we'll add a new, you know, reward on our credit card, is actually think, well, how do we completely reinvent the whole kind of unsecured lending space?
Yeah. Look, we're out of time. It's been a great conversation. I hope you've all gained something out of that and a bit of an insight into how one of the sort of foremost innovative banks in the world is thinking about this. But of course, as I say that, I've got to be careful not to say that too many times, otherwise they'll get a big ego and then they'll be in trouble.
Yeah, that ship has already sailed.
Thanks.
Right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Brett.